all the women in the world that Diddy could have gotten with, he chose 50 Cent's baby mother.
It's a lot of variables to this particular question. Because I talk to a lot of people, older, younger, even my daughter, who's 22, she didn't understand it. So people give their opinion based on what they've experienced and their environment, people they've been around. So to the people that understand boundaries and respect, I always tell men you should never date another man's girl if you're not.
What most people missed is that the biggest part of this story was never on Netflix. And that wasn't an accident. When 50 Cent dropped his Diddy documentary, it looked complete. 4 episodes. Clean structure. Heavy moments. But behind the scenes, something didn't sit right. Not because the story was finished, but because it wasn't. According to 50 himself, entire sections were cut, not softened, not edited down, but removed. And when people heard that, the question wasn't what got cut. It was why. Because you don't leave major material on the floor unless it changes how the whole thing is understood. What makes this different is that the missing piece isn't just about Diddy. It's about motive. Personal motive. The kind that doesn't fade with time, money, or public attention. And once you understand that, everything about why this story keeps escalating suddenly makes sense. Before we go deeper, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Not because of hype, but because this story isn't slowing down, and the next developments won't come with warnings. Now let's get back to what really matters.
After the baby mother of one of his rivals.
Exactly.
Someone who had been taking shots at him for years.
Absolutely.
On purpose.
And he went after her knowing that they had beef.
Right. And slutted her out. Just slutted her out. Having a whole basketball team run a train on her.
Totally
and
did.
just the whole thing, right?
Totally agree.
Right.
But his reputation from when he worked at Uptown, I'll be sure's girlfriend.
Oh, Kim Porter.
Here's where the narrative shifts. After the documentary aired, 50 Cent didn't act relieved. He didn't move on. Instead, he doubled down. More posts, more comments, more pressure. People started asking why he was pushing so hard when the documentary was already out. That's when comedian TK Kirkland stepped in and said what most people weren't saying out loud. This wasn't about clout. It wasn't about content. It was personal. Out of all the women in the world, Diddy allegedly chose to get involved with the mother of 50 Cent's child. Not someone distant. Not someone from a different circle. Someone directly connected. In many cultures, especially among men who move in power circles, that's not just disrespect. That's a deliberate violation. There are unwritten rules that don't need contracts. You don't cross certain lines unless you intend to send a message. TK made it clear that in his entire life, he never knowingly pursued someone connected to a friend or rival. Not because he lacked options, but because respect isn't about access, it's about restraint. And that's what made this situation stand out. Diddy wasn't limited. He had global access, money, influence, and choice. Which means, according to that perspective, this wasn't accidental. It was intentional. When you place that alongside the long-standing tension between Diddy and 50, the picture sharpens. Years of shots. Years of subliminals. Years of competitive distance. This wasn't a random overlap. It looked like a move. And moves like that don't happen without consequences. That's the part the documentary couldn't fully explore without changing tone. Because once motive becomes personal, the story stops being observational and starts becoming confrontational. It explains why 50 didn't just tell the story, he positioned it. Why he framed it with restraint instead of chaos. Why he didn't rush to expose everything at once. It also explains why more people started reaching out to him after the release. When one boundary is crossed publicly, others feel safer speaking privately. And according to 50, that's exactly what happened. New information. New confirmations. New pressure. Not all of it ready for release, but all of it adding weight. This is why the documentary didn't feel like closure. It felt like a warning. Because when someone with resources, motive, and patience decides not to walk away, silence stops being protection. It becomes evidence of fear. And the deeper reason this story keeps moving forward is simple. This isn't just about what happened. It's about why it happened, and why it was never supposed to be ignored. And once a line like that is crossed, there's no version of this story where things quietly return to normal. What followed after that wasn't unity or silence, it was fracture. As soon as the documentary landed, people who had stayed quiet for years started disagreeing publicly, not about whether Diddy's power was real, but about who controlled the story now. And that's when Gene Deal stepped forward, not to defend Diddy, and not to attack 50 directly, but to question something far more uncomfortable: ownership. Gene didn't deny the impact of the documentary. He questioned how it was built. According to him, major parts of the structure, the framing, even specific angles of the story weren't new discoveries. He claimed they echoed ideas he had already shared privately long before cameras rolled. In his view, this wasn't just about missing footage, it was about who shaped the narrative and who got erased in the process. That accusation mattered because it cracked the illusion that this project was fully controlled. If the documentary had been airtight, nobody would be arguing about credit. But Gene wasn't just upset, he was confident. Confident enough to say that if Diddy truly still had the power people believed he did, the documentary would never have survived its release. And that's where the conversation shifted again. Because here's the uncomfortable truth Gene kept repeating. If Diddy could have stopped this, it would already be gone. Cease and desist. Legal pressure. Quiet intervention. None of it worked. The series stayed live. The clips stayed visible. The conversation kept growing.
He said that he had a lot of footage had to be down. The documentary had to be downsized. You understand? I don't really believe that, because a documentary is a documentary, and they could have had 45 minutes. They could have had an hour, to each one of those. You understand? They left out certain things. He said they even left out the one about Sarah Chapman. You understand? And for whatever reason, he probably left out a lot of other different stars too. Situations that they could have spoke about. You understand?
To Gene, that wasn't coincidence, it was evidence. Evidence that something had changed behind the scenes. He pointed out something most viewers didn't notice. Diddy wasn't fighting the release. He wasn't controlling the fallout. He wasn't shaping the response. He was reacting. And in power dynamics, reaction is weakness. That's why the idea of extra footage suddenly mattered so much. 50 hinted that material didn't fit into 4 episodes. He didn't say it was weak. He said there was too much. And instead of shelving it forever, he suggested YouTube, a platform with fewer gatekeepers and no institutional protection. That suggestion alone sent a signal. This wasn't about prestige anymore. It was about exposure. Gene made another point that stuck. He reminded people that Diddy still knows powerful figures. Netflix connections. Industry relationships. Old favors. If any of that still carried the weight it once did, pressure would have been applied quietly and effectively. But nothing happened. No shutdown. No disappearance. No retraction. And that silence told its own story. From there, the focus widened beyond the documentary itself and into behavior patterns that suddenly looked harder to ignore. Gene described what he believed was a long-standing fixation Diddy had with Tupac. Not admiration, not rivalry, but something unresolved. According to him, it wasn't just about music or legacy. It showed up in choices, relationships, even speeches. The way certain words were reused. The way certain figures were echoed. The way certain women connected to Tupac later appeared in Diddy's orbit. To Gene, this wasn't random. It was repetition. When you place that alongside the personal boundary crossing with 50, the picture sharpens again. These weren't isolated decisions. They were part of a pattern where proximity to rivals mattered, where control wasn't just about money but about symbolism, about possession, about rewriting proximity to power. And here's the part that unsettled people most. None of this felt rushed. It felt calculated. Not explosive, but patient. Not reactive, but persistent. Which is why the documentary didn't feel like an endpoint. It felt like a phase. Because when multiple insiders start arguing over who told which part of the story first, It means the story itself is no longer containable. It's bigger than one voice, bigger than one platform. And once that happens, the question stops being who's telling the truth and becomes who can still control it. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. Whatever power Diddy once used to silence, delay, or redirect narratives no longer worked the way it used to. And the fact that people were now openly debating what was left out, instead of whether it should exist at all, showed just how far the balance had shifted. Because the most dangerous moment for any figure isn't when accusations appear. It's when control disappears. As the focus moved forward, the story stopped being about what was shown and started revolving around what was missing. That absence became impossible to ignore. Because when a documentary claims to expose a system, the people left out can sometimes say more than the people included. And no name came up more than Kim Porter. Viewers noticed it immediately. Someone who had been at the center of Diddy's personal and professional life for years was reduced to brief mentions and a handful of images. No deep context. No exploration of her perspective. No serious examination of what she may have seen or known. For many, that omission felt deliberate, not accidental. Insiders began saying the same thing quietly and then publicly. Kim wasn't just a partner. She was present during pivotal moments. She witnessed relationships, business moves, conflicts, and private behavior that never reached the public eye. According to people who claimed to know her, she carried information that made others uncomfortable. Information that didn't fit neatly into a 4-episode structure or a controlled narrative. Gene Deal was blunt about it. He said Kim knew far more than people realized and that her story was dangerous precisely because of how much time she spent inside that world. He claimed she had considered documenting her experiences, that she had shared parts of her story with others, and that those accounts made people nervous. Whether every detail of those claims can be verified or not, the pattern around her silence stood out. Because when someone so close to the center is barely discussed, it raises a question. Was she protected, or was the audience protected from what her perspective might have revealed? That question deepened when others began sharing stories about control. Not rumors, but behavior. Monitoring conversations. Reacting aggressively to perceived disloyalty. Creating an environment where privacy didn't exist the way people assumed it did. Stories like these didn't rely on spectacle. They relied on consistency. Different voices, different years, same dynamics. And once those dynamics were laid out, the documentary's gaps felt less like oversight and more like pressure points. Then the conversation widened again, beyond individual relationships and into environment. The parties. The gatherings that had been whispered about for years. Events that were once brushed off as excess or celebrity chaos now looked different when viewed through the lens of control and surveillance. The lack of detail around who attended, who stayed late, who distanced themselves later, that silence was loud. People started asking why so many high-profile figures who were once visibly close now refused to speak. Why statements were vague. Why distancing happened quietly. In moments like this, denials usually come fast. When they don't, it suggests calculation. And underneath all of it was a deeper question being raised by voices like Jaguar Wright. Not about fame, but about formation. About how early environments shape later behavior. About how power, when learned young and unchecked, doesn't disappear, it evolves. She pointed to childhood, to instability, to exposure to adult spaces too early. Not as an excuse, but as context. Context that explains patterns without justifying them. Because understanding how someone becomes who they are doesn't erase responsibility. It explains how repetition becomes normalized. That perspective changed how people watched everything else. Not as isolated incidents, but as a long arc. One shaped by proximity to influence, silence, and reward. An arc where accountability was delayed, not denied. By this point, the documentary itself almost faded into the background. What mattered was what it unlocked. Conversations people avoided for years were now happening openly. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence were being re-examined. And the absence of certain voices, especially those closest to the center, felt intentional. This was no longer about entertainment. It was about environment, access, and who benefits when stories stay fragmented. And as the narrative moved closer to the present, one reality settled in. The most revealing parts of this story may not be what's already been released. They may be what people are still hesitating to say out loud. Because once a system starts to crack, it doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures slowly. And in those fractures, the truth usually surfaces next. By the time everything circled back to the present, one thing became clear. This story no longer belonged to any single documentary, interview, or voice. It had moved beyond control. What started as a limited series quietly turned into a pressure point. Not because of what it proved, but because of what it forced people to reconsider. Power, silence, proximity, and how long certain dynamics are allowed to exist before anyone is willing to look directly at them. The most revealing development wasn't outrage. It was restraint. Statements that never came. Lawsuits that weren't filed. Cease and desist letters that never arrived. In an industry where reaction is usually instant, hesitation stood out. Because hesitation often signals uncertainty, not confidence. Insiders kept repeating the same thing in different ways. If this material truly had no weight, it would already be gone. If it could be buried, it would have been. The fact that it remained accessible, discussed, and expanded on suggested something had shifted behind the scenes. And that shift wasn't loud. It didn't look like chaos. It looked like recalculation. What people were watching now wasn't exposure for entertainment. It was exposure changing behavior. Distancing. Silence. Rewriting proximity. Carefully choosing words. Those aren't reactions to rumors. Those are responses to risk. This is the stage where stories stop being debated and start being assessed. Where narrative gives way to consequence. Where people realize that what they didn't say years ago now matters just as much as what they say today. No one is claiming everything is known. In fact, the opposite is true. What's unsettled is how much may still be unreleased, how many voices have yet to speak, and how many decisions were made assuming privacy would last forever. Because once information enters the public conversation at this level, it doesn't retreat. It waits. It connects. It resurfaces in places people didn't expect. This isn't an ending. It's a threshold. And from here forward, the story won't be shaped by who talks the loudest, but by what can no longer be ignored.